Welcome back. We're continuing our analysis of the legacy of Sir John A MacDonald, Canada's first Prime Minister. And joining me for that is Greg Piasetzki. Greg, thank you for giving us some historical context of Sir John A. But as we mentioned, there have been numerous attacks that I did not hear growing up as a child in Canada, but now in the last decade or so, we seem to hear them. What are some of the main concerns that certain groups or some Canadians have with Sir John A MacDonald?
Well, most of the recent attacks relate to his alleged mishandling of the Indigenous issues, including residential schools. There's claims that the schools were a machine for cultural genocide, and even occasionally people talk about actual genocide. Quotes from parliamentary debates have been taken out of context and turned on their head to use against him. However, I think a closer review of the historical record, particularly the records of the Department of Indian Affairs, shows that such claims don't stand up to scrutiny. I would like to just remind people on this National Day of Truth and Reconciliation that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission stated that reconciliation requires public truth sharing and that all Canadians share responsibility for establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships. And I think that's what we're trying to do here today. We're going to talk a little bit about the attacks made and why they aren't well-founded, but this is what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has asked us to do as a people.
Yeah, and I think that's great that you highlight that, because if we want to know the truth, then it should be rooted in historical fact, not fiction. And I think that's important. And I know on my show we try to really stick to what the facts are. So right. Why does he get such a bad rap with residential schools? What are the facts surrounding his policy with residential schools? Was it even his policy?
Well, yes and no. I mean, residential schools existed for a few hundred years before Confederation. They were run by charitable organizations, usually churches, and there are only a few of them in Canada. The population of Canada was tiny. It was a few 100,000. So there were a few residential schools for Indians, and they were day schools / residential. What we're mostly talking about, though, is the schools built after 1870. And we have to remember the residential schools and the Indian schools in general, because there was a school system for Indians that was day schools and residential. That was part of a wider public movement that believed that all children should have some basic reading, writing, and arithmetic skills. That was a populist movement, and politicians were responding to it. And in 1870, in Ontario, for example, we started to bring in compulsory education for 4 years. So the residential schools and the Indian schools are happening right in the middle of this wider public movement that says every kid needs some basic skills. And Canadians thought that Indigenous Canadians would need the very same skills to survive in a society that was moving from almost entirely agrarian, 90% of the population lived in rural areas, to 80 years later, 90% urban. Huge change. You had to have some skills to survive in an urban environment. So the system of Indian day and residential schools that was set up was just to give Indians the same skills that other Canadians had. And the government built more than 300 day schools and about 80 residential schools. And the 80 residential schools were there just to serve kids who were in more remote areas where you couldn't base a teacher. There's no place to put a teacher where a teacher could live while teaching. There weren't enough kids to support a day school. So they were put in residential schools where they draw from a much larger area and put them in a single school. But contrary to the modern narrative, most kids were attending day schools, always. Most Native children attended a day school, not a residential school. And the ones who attended residential...
I was gonna say, was it voluntarily attendance or was it mandatory attendance?
It was, well, let me just get to that.
Okay.
So first of all, the majority attended day schools, went home to their parents every night. The remainder were in the residential schools, but they had a 2-month summer holiday. If they were close, they were sent home for Easter, they were sent home for Christmas. These were not prison camps. But here's the big point I'd like people to take up. In residential schools and in day schools, most students, over half, dropped out after grade 1. That was always true. It was true in 1890 when Sir John A was Prime Minister. He died in 1891. It was true in 1950 when they began closing the residential schools, not because they thought they were terrible, but they were expensive, inefficient. Air travel allowed them to move kids more easily to be near a public school, et cetera, et cetera. But keep that in mind. Half the children, Indian children, would drop out after grade 1. Almost nobody went past grade 5. So that's not what you or I would consider a concentration camp, a prison, cultural genocide. In fact, in 1915, the Americans sent a commissioner up to study our school system because they thought we were doing a great job of retaining native culture while providing some education to Indian kids. So
Wow.
they
So
were
that's,
impressed with the.
yeah, I was gonna say that's a narrative or a point that we seldom hear. We're going to pick up this discussion in just a moment.